It is the voice of Indiana County. It's WCCS 101.1 FM, AM 1160, and WCCSradio.com. And we're on the line this morning with Buddy Levy, who's the author of the book Realms of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue. We had Buddy with us when he wrote his book Labyrinth of Ice, and that was a crazy story. This one is well, I don't know if I can say more incredible, but it's as incredible because we're talking three different stories here connected in some way about three amazing explorers of the Arctic. Buddy, good morning.
Todd, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad that you're here. Our visit is presented by Marcus & Mack, voted best law firm and best personal injury lawyer 3 years in a row on the Best of Indiana County contest. Visit them online at marcusandmack.com. So it really is. It's three books in one because we meet these three guys. And the first of those is Walter Wellman, which I'm guessing nobody, unless they are real students, know the name Walter Wellman. But he was a literal pioneer in Arctic exploration, and in particular, the kind of Arctic exploration that we're talking about. We think of them as blimps. Dirigible is the name, but he was the first of the three that you chronicled, and his story is amazing because he wasn't one of those professionals we think of, except for he took his journalism career and turned it into an amazing exploration career.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I actually had not heard of Walter Wellman until I bumped into this story. Excuse me. And he is really a remarkable American figure who, by the time we meet him in this book, he has established himself. I mean, he's an Ohio-born, self-taught guy who became one of the most known journalists in the United States, covering he was a Washington insider. He covered the Transcontinental Railroad. He hobnobbed with Theodore Roosevelt and captains of industry like Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. But he was also really fascinated with exploration and technology and travel. And so he decided to have this side hustle as an Arctic explorer after a number of attempts to make it to the North Pole. And you have to remember that when we open in this book, the North Pole is still this blank spot on the map, this holy grail of exploration. And so Wellman, after a couple of failed attempts in the old tried and true dog sled method, decides that flight is going to be the key to unlock the North Pole and the polar seas. And so he decides that he's going to be the first one to try to fly 185-foot, 274,000 cubic feet of flammable hydrogen to the North Pole.
It really fascinates me about this guy that knowing the risks that he was undertaking at this time and then adding to them by trying to fly over the ice rather than to go on the ice, he had already had quite the adventuresome career. He had suffered greatly physically because of it, and yet here he was again, and so he and his Airship America are involved in the first attempt that we read about in your book. He really was dedicated to the craft, and we get an appreciation, I think, of what it took in order to make one of these ships, particularly at that time, but the amount of money and support that you needed to make all of this happen.
Yeah, so he was a pretty shrewd impresario also. You know, he has this airship built in France, dismantled, and then sets up this Arctic workshop in this place called Svalbard, which is a little less than halfway between northern Norway and the North Pole. It used to be called Spitsbergen. And so he assembles all these men and machine shops there and gets a small skeletal crew. And he straps a 75 horsepower motor onto what is essentially an elongated hydrogen-filled balloon. And, kind of like an astronaut, gets into this craft with a couple other people, having studied wind currents and everything, but and decides, I'm going to try to fly to the North Pole because no one has been able to do it over ice. And, his theory, he actually wrote about it in 1883, but his theory is that, he can go a lot faster, and we don't have, they brought enough food on the airship in the event that they're going to, that something happens and they end up on the ice and they crash, to survive for a while. And so he gets kind of ridiculed in the press, but the other thing that he does that's quite amazing is that he set up wireless telegram situation in the Arctic and sent the first telegraph to Theodore Roosevelt from the Arctic regions. And so he was really quite a pioneer in aeronautics and radio and also journalism.
Wellman, of course, is the first of the three explorers that we hear about or read about in your book called Realm of Ice and Sky, and his journey ends in the Atlantic Ocean, literally. And then we meet Roald Amundsen, who is a name that I'm sure many, many people are familiar with. The guy really was a legend in his own time, wasn't he?
He was, and I actually end up calling him the GOAT in the book because even though, Shackleton for the Antarctic exploration is really the household name, everybody knows about him because everyone survived his ordeal. But Amundsen really achieved much more than anyone else. He was the first to the South Pole and made it back alive, the first man with a small team through the Northwest Passage, and ultimately, along with this Italian named Umberto Nobile and an American named Lincoln Ellsworth, becomes the first to verifiably pass over the North Pole in a dirigible in 1926. And so, this really cool sort of passing of the torch where Wellman fails essentially, but 20 years later, Amundsen decides that after, by the way, butting his head against the icebergs for a long time, that Wellman was probably right and that the airship is the way. And this Amundsen is this Norwegian grizzled, gnarly dude who is just, he's spent most of his life out on the ice and doing all of these travails. And he's nearly retired by the time we meet him, and he gets convinced to come out of retirement by this American guy named Lincoln Ellsworth, who is really fascinating too. And then Amundsen attempts to fly airplanes to the North Pole and later hooks up with Umberto Nobile, the Italian airship designer under Mussolini's fascist military government. And then they strike out from Svalbard as well.
It's interesting. The first trip that we talk about is the airplane attempt, and that didn't end well, but somehow they made it back, and it really is a tale of daring and of bravery and really, really hard work to save themselves. And it puzzled me reading the book that after that experience, when they seemed so close, he said, "No, it's the airship that is going to do this, and not the airplane." But he did, and so the Norge was born. That's the name of the airship that Nobile designs for him and ends up being the pilot of him. They make it over the North Pole, and they keep on flying, and eventually they end up in Alaska. But it does not go well between Nobile and Amundsen. They end up being really, really on opposite ends of the publicity, and they become bitter toward one another.
Yeah, two things on that. I'm glad you brought up the airplane because one of the things that was most compelling to me is that at the beginning of this book, and even up until the 20s when Amundsen attempts in an airplane, there's a real question, and people forget this. The Wright brothers are trying to fly and succeeding for short distances in 1903, but for this entire period, it's not a done deal whether the airship or the airplane is going to have supremacy of the skies for not only military purposes, but for commercial travel. And so when Amundsen attempts in an airplane, what he realizes is that while they're faster, once you go down or force down or crash on the ice, it's nowhere near a guarantee that you're going to be able to lift off again. And they also can't carry nearly as much. So the airship has this advantage in terms of payload. You can bring much, much more. And because they travel at slower speeds, there's some potential element of safety. But you're right. even though Amundsen and Nobile are highly successful in this incredible expedition of 1926, by the time they reach Alaska, there's a bitter feud and they end up, there's a lot of mudslinging, and Norway has national pride, and Italy does, and so there's all of this bad blood that exists between these two men, and it's quite unfortunate because they've just achieved something really remarkable. But it ends up prompting Umberto Nobile 2 years later to decide, out of pride and ego, that he's going to do it again in another airship called the Italia, and with an almost exclusively Italian crew for the glory of Italy. And it's a great idea, as many great ideas are, until things go catastrophically awry.
Yeah, they really do. And that brings us to part 3 of the book. The fascinating transition to me is Nobile sort of comes off as a villainous, egotistical type of guy in the Amundsen section, and then in the 3rd section of the book with the Italia and the eventual crash. And I don't want to give away way too much on this. The eventual crash and the tragedy and the rescue that must be undertaken in order to get him, and what happens to Amundsen in relation to that. Nobile sort of redeems himself in the reader's eye, if not in the eyes of the Italian populace. That takes a bit longer for him.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It really illustrates to me that perception is one thing, and then people can change, right? So Amundsen changes too, but Nobile, you're absolutely right. He's haughty and proud and indignant in part 2, where he just feels slighted, and then once he crashes his airship, there's a humility there, but there's also I think a deep camaraderie that occurs. These men are stranded on the ice, and no one else in the world knows where they are, and then and bones are broken, and some members have died, right? And so you've got a situation in which a leader has to really rise to the occasion, and I think Nobile does, and he becomes much more democratic in his decision making, and he softens. And I'm really glad you observed that, because he changed, in my opinion and my estimation of him, and I really softened too in how I felt about him because of what he went through. And then you've got this incredible survival story. Part 3 is just this amazing survivals on the ice story, where it's quite uncertain whether anyone's going to get to them. And you have a multinational rescue operation, the likes of which really have never been seen again. Something like 1,400 men, a dozen countries, and ships, airplanes, ski troops. The world is involved, and the reading public is just ravenous to hear what has happened to these men.
Yeah, it really is true. In fact, some men, including one very notable man, losing their life in the rescue effort, and we'll let folks read about that because it is such an amazing story. And you've done such a masterful job of writing it. It's called Realm of Ice and Sky, Triumph, Tragedy, and History's Greatest Arctic Rescue by Buddy Levy. It's available now, and folks can pick this up and shiver a little bit as they read it. Can you write something about the tropics next time, Buddy? I'm just asking.
Todd, I will. I'll get right on it. I'm going to head to the Bahamas or Bermuda.
All right. Well, I'm sure that it's going to be, whatever the story is next time, it's going to be a great one. Now, this one certainly is The Realm of Ice and Sky. Buddy, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you.
Have a great day.
You too.